Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are joining us today. And also thank Dr. Jung for very kind introduction. And also I must start by thanking Dr. Kim Seok-chul, President and his team at Keynote for organizing today's meeting. It is a great pleasure and honor for me to speak following Dr. Jung-in Moon and Representative Yoon Gun-young. Like Dr. Moon, by the way, I'm also a member of APLN. He is ably leading. And like him, I was also a convert from the believer in deterrence to nuclear disarmament after I moved to the UN 13 years ago. And my converted conviction became stronger because I had to visit Hiroshima and Nagasaki every August to commemorate the victims of the atomic bombings there. Today, I was given the task to talk about sustaining the NPT for the next 50 years. But I want to first take one step back by looking at the past 50 years. I'm sure all of you agree that the record of NPT for the last 50 years is mixed with the successes and failures. And I think it's kind of a classic case of how we look at a bottle of wine, half empty, half full. Depending on how we look at it, if one is an optimist, he or she may say it's a success. If he or she is a pessimist, he may see as a failure. But most of us, somewhere in between, maybe say it's both. Personally, I'm on the side of looking at more of a success than a failure. As a matter of fact, NPT has failed to prevent unrecognized proliferators from developing nuclear weapons programs. But it is also fair to argue that thanks to NPT, the number of proliferators was contained to a single digit. As President Kennedy was often famously quoted, he predicted in early 1960s the number of nuclear weapon possessing states would rise to above a couple of dozen states within 10 years. But thanks to NPT, which was concluded in 1968, the number was contained to a single digit, less than 10. Also, the number of nuclear weapons went down dramatically from 54,000 during the Cold War peak to 12 to 15,000. So it was a reduction of 70 to 80% of the nuclear arsenal. Without the NPT framework, the INF Treaty or START and New START Treaty between the US and the former Soviet Union would have been much more difficult. And also without the NPT, it would have been almost virtually impossible to contain the number of unrecognized proliferators to a single digit. And also, in the initial post-Cold War period, the NPT was able to be indefinitely extended in 1995. And the second international disarmament architectural piece called Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was agreed in 1998. So there was a very happy moment for international nuclear disarmament. But unfortunately, that happy moment didn't last long. Entering the new millennium of the 21st century, the major power relationship between the US on the one hand and China and Russia on the other hand began to be tense again. And as a result, political climate. By the way, I also very much support Dr. Moon's hope that we have to see depoliticization of the NPT framework, but as a matter of reality, the political climate surrounding the NPT has gotten worse, with the major power relationship has been becoming tense. This worsening political climate led to my second point on where we stand now. NPT is now facing, I think, very serious challenges that are deeper and wider than the past 50 years. The growing mistrust between nuclear weapon states slow down the push for nuclear disarmament agenda, with the recent warning signs of even going backward. This in turn contributed to worsening the global consensus on the NPT bargain of nuclear disarmament in return for non-proliferation and peaceful uses of energy. I'm sure all of us wholeheartedly support today's theme. We all want to see NPT to be effective, healthy for another 50 years. But I'm afraid the two divisions between nuclear weapon states and among non-nuclear weapon states are threatening the future of NPT. Firstly, division between nuclear weapon states is growing. The specter of a renewed nuclear arms race is coming back under the name of the nuclear weapon modernization programs of the US, Russia, and China. Heated competition in the state-of-the-art technologies has compounded both the strategic and conventional security landscapes. Unregulated advances in technologies in cyber and outer spaces, as well as artificial intelligence, are compounding the risks of massive disruption on top of the existing threat of mass destruction. Secondly, division among non-nuclear weapon states, as Dr. Moon referred to, is also growing between nuclear umbrella states, those who wear nuclear umbrella, and those who don't. And this division led to the Nuclear Prohibition Treaty in 2017. And Nuclear Prohibition Treaty is also abbreviated as NPT, but different NPT. And this new NPT poses two fundamental questions, one each respectively to nuclear weapon states and to non-nuclear weapon states. Firstly, to nuclear weapon states. Why is it so difficult to delegitimize nuclear weapons? Unlike other weapons of mass destruction, biological and chemical. Biological and chemical weapons are declared as unusable because it is so bad its use constitutes the crime against humanity, then why we cannot do the same thing on nuclear weapons? Why nuclear weapon states want to treat nuclear weapons differently despite the much worse humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons? Nuclear weapons are by far the worst weapons of all WMDs. But why it is so difficult not to say nuclear weapons are bad weapons and should be prohibited? The second question, which is posed to non-nuclear umbrella, non-nuclear weapon states. How do they intend to achieve a nuclear weapon-free world without participation of a single nuclear weapon state? How can they persuade nuclear weapon states to join the journey of prohibiting and eventually eliminating nuclear weapons? Both of these two fundamental questions are tough but legitimate, and they deserve good answers for the collective interests of the whole humanity, as also Dr. Moon alluded to. The bargain of NPT is clear in its destination point, which is a nuclear weapon-free world. But NPT is not clear in how we reach that destination point. How we move from now 12 to 15,000 nuclear weapons to zero nuclear weapon. It'll be a long path. Maybe there can be many steps that need to be taken. But NPT is unclear about how we move from here to the end point and what methodology we should be taken. I believe we need to pool our wisdom, both nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. How and what will be the best path leading to that end goal. CTBT was intended as a building block along this long path. And fissile material cut-off treaty was intended as the second step, but long delayed. Even its negotiation couldn't start. And CTBT, as of today, didn't come into effect. Although I was introduced as one of the eminent persons of CTBT, although I'm not sure I'm eminent enough, but we cannot solve that puzzle. How come the great disarmament peace couldn't come into effect over 20 years? And the next step even couldn't start being negotiated. And out of this frustration, the proponents of great majority of members of NPT started raising the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, and their efforts led to the Nuclear Prohibition Treaty. And proponents of Nuclear Prohibition Treaty believe Nuclear Prohibition Treaty can be an important step to accelerate the movement from here to the end point. But nuclear weapon states do not subscribe to this view. And this fundamental difference needs to be bridged for the interest of the whole humanity. Proliferation risks also persist. Despite the concerted international efforts, Iran, Democratic People's Republic of Korea remain as sources of serious proliferation risk, whose mismanagement would cause domino effects to the neighbors and can then pose irreparable damages to the NPT regime. Against all these troubling backdrops, this year's NPT review process is taking place at a critical juncture. The worsening political climate has made the past 9 review processes very bumpy. The current review process is also part of the package for the indefinite extension of NPT 25 years ago. Ever since, every review is alternated with an outcome and no outcome. And this year's review falls at a doubly symbolic milestone moment because it marks 50 years of NPT and 25 years of the indefinite extension. And also it follows the last review which ended without an outcome. So if we fail this time to produce an outcome, it will be deeply troubling. Because we fail at the doubly symbolic moment and also 2 consecutive repeats of no outcome would send very troubling signals for the future of NPT, and we must avoid it. NPT review is like a pit stop in a Formula One car race. It is intended to review whether the NPT framework is working or not in the real world to deal with real-world challenges. And if it is not working, then what should be fixed? So it is also like a mirror to reflect the developments which have taken place and were expected to emerge in the real world. So there, the risks of politicization always exist. But NPT review process is meant to address that problem. So we have to work harder to make this review to produce an outcome. And here we have a good news and bad news. First, the good news is the US President Biden's election and his administration's reset to nuclear disarmament, architecture, and agenda. The same US negotiating team who contributed to producing the last 2010 outcome is coming back. I think it may have been a blessing in disguise sent by nature because COVID-19 pandemic pushed the review process scheduled last year to this year. If it had happened last year, as originally planned, it was doomed to another failure under the Trump administration. So buying time, thanks to the pandemic, sounds paradoxical, but it allows us a breathing space for negotiation and better political climate. On the other hand, straining US-China relationship, US-Russia relationship, as well as the stalled negotiations on 2 outstanding proliferation cases are a bad news. So I keep my fingers crossed. Now, about the tasks ahead of us. We all know there is no magic solution. We don't have any magic solution. First and foremost, we must step up our efforts to produce an agreed outcome. And agreed outcome will be the positive step for the start of the next 50 years of NPT. The alternative, as I said, would be disastrous and unacceptable. I hope it will serve as the wake-up call to all countries. In order to produce an outcome, we must work together to bridge the gap between nuclear weapon states and among non-nuclear weapon states. Efforts for consensus building must be done because there is no other way to talk. We have to talk, and we have to engage. And three-way dialogues need to be intensified. Firstly, to reduce mistrust between nuclear weapon states. Secondly, to restore international consensus on the way forward to keep the NPT bargain of nuclear disarmament, non-proliferation, as well as peaceful uses of nuclear energy between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. And thirdly, to expand the common ground on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons among non-nuclear weapon states, as Dr. Moon spoke earlier. Meaning between non-nuclear umbrella, non-nuclear weapon states, and nuclear umbrella, non-nuclear. I think we have too much alphabetical soup. Consensus building is urgently needed on the next step, going beyond the nuclear prohibition treaty toward our common destination of a nuclear weapon-free world. The first burden is, of course, on nuclear weapon states. They must work harder to bridge their division and come up with a realistic and actionable plan for nuclear disarmament and arms control. Of course, here, the leadership role must be taken by the US. Renewed strategic dialogue between US and China is desirable, but if it is not feasible in the immediate term, 1.5 track dialogue needs to be pursued to build the trust and bridge the gap between the two governments. The second burden is on non-nuclear weapon states. They must work harder to reconcile their differences on the nuclear prohibition treaty. And also, another long pending issue is to create the zone free of WMD in the Middle East. Fortunately, after long efforts, the first meeting on Middle East zone free of weapons of mass destruction was held. So it was a positive development. I believe all these efforts deserve more direct and in-person engagement. I hope the upcoming review conference can be held under such a setting. If the review conference is further pushed for that, because now it is scheduled to be held in August. But because of still uncertainty whether August will be okay to allow in-person, in-depth negotiation, still remains to be seen. If it is further pushed, I think it may work as another blessing in disguise to give more time all delegations from nuclear weapon states, nuclear umbrella, non-nuclear weapon states, non-nuclear umbrella, non-nuclear weapon states, to reconcile their differences, narrow down their differences, and expand the common ground. Maybe at least one good thing COVID-19 pandemic is doing for global agenda. It is still a bit too early, all these things, with all these factors taken in together to predict about the prospects of review conference outcome. But I remain cautiously optimistic, and as I expect all countries to step up with more buying time, their efforts. But we have to also remember, even if we are able to produce an outcome from the coming review conference, it will be only the beginning of the long process to follow up. Because we learned a painful lesson in 2015 that the high expectations were created after 2010 successful outcome under President Obama's leadership, following his Prague speech and his Nobel Peace Prize award. But when most of non-nuclear weapon states didn't see the faithful implementation of that successful outcome, even higher disappointments were set in to make 2015 review conference a failure, ended up without an outcome. And we should not repeat that bad example. So what I'm asking all of us is to first try to produce an outcome, but even try harder to implement that outcome. So the outcome should produce an action plan which can be implementable. And there again, I count on the leadership of US, first making sure come up with a real action plan for nuclear disarmament and arms control between nuclear weapon states, and also staying on top of negotiating a settlement, diplomatic settlement on outstanding non-proliferation risks, Iran and DPRK, as well as managing the long-standing issues inside NPT framework, including nuclear prohibition treaty, differences on the nuclear prohibition treaty, on the methodology, how we should move from here, how we build the blocks toward end goal of a nuclear weapon-free world, and how we help manage the discussion on creating a zone free of WMD in the Middle East, not going out of spiral. So I count on the colleagues joining us from Washington and also Beijing, Tokyo, and many other places today and tomorrow. My last words on the role Korea can play. Korea is in a position to play double breaching roles between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states, as well as among non-nuclear weapon states. Because Korea's position is unique, as it's an ally of the US, umbrella state, but has been a steadfast and staunch supporter of the NPT framework. Korea can contribute to narrowing down differences and expanding common ground for a stronger future of NPT for the next 50 years from a moral high ground as a country to give up nuclear weapon option despite the lingering and real nuclear threats. I count on my Korean colleagues here and also who will join us tomorrow to contribute proactively and constructively in that process. I thank you for your attention. I wish all the participants of today and tomorrow's meeting a great success. Thank you so much.